Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I know some of you use these videos to help you relax before bed, so make sure you are comfortable. Lock the door and let the rain start to fall. If you haven't already, hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's dive into today's story, a chilling disappearance that will leave you questioning everything. Helen Arias was just like anyone else. On the morning of April 7, 2021, she woke up, planned a day trip, and left her home in Uedo, Spain, around 9 o'clock a.m. She was heading to Prao de Espina, a small rural town where her former partner's family lived. This wasn't her first time making the journey. It was a route she had taken before with no issues. She reassured her mother she would return that evening. There was nothing unusual about the trip. Helen's day began without a hint of trouble. Her phone was active until around noon, just as she arrived in Prao de Espina. After that, all contact stopped. No texts, no calls, no online activity. Her mother tried reaching her throughout the evening, but there was nothing. As the hours passed, the unease grew. This wasn't like Helen. She was always punctual, always stayed in touch, especially on trips like this. But tonight, there was silence. At first, the family wasn't immediately alarmed. Perhaps Helen was just delayed. But as the night wore on, and the calls went unanswered, the worry began to grow. By 10 o'clock, panic set in. Helen had promised to be back before dark, and now her phone was off. Her family couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next step was to call Jose, Helen's ex-boyfriend, who lived in Prao de Espina. He was the last person Helen was supposed to visit. His response was strange. He claimed that he hadn't seen Helen that day and hadn't received any calls from her. At first, the family thought this was a simple misunderstanding, but his lack of concern made them uneasy. Jose offered no help, didn't rush to Uedo to help with the search, and seemed strangely indifferent. By morning, the family had reported Helen missing to the police. Investigators started working on the case, first by tracking Helen's phone. The data confirmed that she had arrived in Prao de Espina earlier that day. But after noon, the signal was lost. The police began questioning local residents and searched the area. One witness reported seeing someone matching Helen's description near the edge of town, but the identification was unclear. The investigation was off to a rocky start. The investigation seemed to stall at first. Helen's car was found near a train station in a nearby town, locked with no visible damage. Her belongings, including her ID and wallet, were still inside, but her phone was missing. No sign of forced entry, no signs of a struggle. If she had left the car willingly, why would she leave everything behind? Could she have run away? Was it voluntary? The idea didn't sit well with the investigators or her family. Helen had no history of impulsive behavior. As the investigation continued, the pieces began to fall into place. What had begun as a missing person case was quickly turning into something far more complex, and no one could have anticipated just how dark the truth would get. What was thought to be a routine disappearance was slowly revealing itself to be a far more sinister story. The story of Helen Arias was just beginning, but the questions were already piling up. What happened to her on that April day? Where was she now? And why had Jose shown such indifference? As the search continued, the answers would start to reveal themselves in the most shocking of ways. April 8, 2021, the day after Helen Arias disappeared, Detective Alejandro Perez arrived in Prao de Espina early that morning. He had been briefed on the case. At first glance, there seemed to be nothing more than a simple missing persons report, but something didn't feel right. As he stood at the edge of town, staring at the quiet streets, he could almost feel the tension in the air. There were no signs of forced entry into Helen's car, no obvious clues as to where she might have gone. But the deeper Detective Perez looked, the more unsettling the situation became. Jose Boadia, Helen's ex-boyfriend, had been the last to see her, and his statements were beginning to raise red flags. When Detective Perez met with him, Jose's demeanor seemed off. The story he told matched the data from Helen's phone. She had indeed made it to Prao de Espina. But then, he said something peculiar. "I didn't see Helen that day. Not at all. She didn't even make it to my house." Perez's eyebrows furrowed. "She didn't make it to your house," he repeated, eyes narrowing. "But she told her family she was coming to see you." Jose's gaze flickered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. "She must have gone somewhere else," he insisted. His voice was calm, almost too calm. Perez wasn't convinced. The initial investigation into Helen's phone records provided no answers, but the geolocation data confirmed she had reached Prao de Espina. That much was clear. But there was a gap in the data that made no sense. Her phone had been active until around noon. But after that, it went silent. Perez knew this wasn't typical. Helen was always in contact with her family. Could she have simply gone off the grid? Or was there something more sinister at play? It wasn't long before the detective was back at Helen's car, searching it again for anything they might have missed. Her bag was still inside. There was no sign of struggle, but the lack of any other clue bothered Perez. If she had been abducted, why hadn't the perpetrator taken anything? And if Helen had left willingly, why hadn't she reached out to anyone? That's when it happened. One of the officers combing through the car found something unusual beneath the passenger seat. A scrap of fabric. It was torn, faded, and stained with a dark, reddish-brown substance. It looked out of place. Could it be blood? Was it a piece of her clothing? The discovery was small, but it felt like a breakthrough. Back at the station, Detective Perez was piecing together the events, and one thing stood out. Jose's silence. Perez decided to press him harder. "Jose, tell me again. What did you do that day?" Jose hesitated before speaking. "I went out to meet some friends, had a drink. You know, just a normal day." Perez's gut told him this was more than a normal day. The evidence from Helen's car, the fabric scrap, and Jose's strange behavior were all adding up to something bigger. The detective was convinced that there was more to the story. As the day turned into night, Perez couldn't shake the feeling that they were just scratching the surface. Every clue, every inconsistency, led back to one place: Jose. There was a deeper connection here, something hidden beneath the surface. Detective Perez took one last look at the empty streets of Prao de Espina before heading back to the station. The investigation was far from over, and the deeper they dug, the more they realized that Helen's disappearance was far from a simple case. April 9th, 2021. The search for Helen Arias continued, but as the hours ticked by, the frustration within the investigation grew. Detective Perez sat at his desk, the latest report spread across the table before him. It had been 2 days since Helen's disappearance, and while several areas had been searched and more witnesses interviewed, there were still no answers. The deeper Perez dug, the more he realized this wasn't just a case of a missing person. It felt deliberate. A carefully crafted lie woven into the events by someone close to her. Jose, the ex-boyfriend, remained an enigma. His calmness, his insistence that nothing was out of the ordinary, made Perez uneasy. No one acted that way when someone they cared about disappeared, especially not when they were the last to see them. The detective decided to take a closer look at Jose's alibi. Helen's phone records had confirmed her last known location in Prao de Espina, but it was the gap in the data that didn't add up. After noon, her phone went dead. Her family had made several attempts to contact her, but all their calls went unanswered. The timing was strange. If she had been planning to leave, why hadn't she told anyone? Her mother had said their last conversation had been brief, reassuring, and without any sign of distress. But now, in hindsight, everything seemed suspicious. Perez knew they had to keep pushing. They couldn't afford to overlook a single detail. Back in Prado de Espina, Perez stood outside the Boadia family home. Jose had said nothing unusual had happened during his interactions with Helen. But Perez wasn't convinced. He had been trained to see beyond the surface, and everything about Jose's behavior was setting off alarm bells. The way he dismissed concerns, the lack of empathy. It didn't feel right. Perez walked up to the front door, knocked, and waited. Jose answered, his face a mask of indifference. "Detective," he said, voice steady, but with a hint of irritation. "You're back." "We need to talk again, Jose," Perez replied, his tone firm. "This time we need the truth." Jose's expression flickered, almost imperceptibly, before he stepped aside and motioned for Perez to enter. The moment the detective crossed the threshold, the tension in the air was palpable. The house was eerily quiet. Perez's eyes scanned the surroundings, noting the slight disarray. An open book on the table, a half-finished cup of coffee, the faint smell of something cooking in the kitchen. It felt like a normal home. But nothing was normal about this situation. As they sat down in the living room, Perez looked directly at Jose. "I've been reviewing the phone records. The car, the timeline. It doesn't add up. I need you to tell me everything, Jose. All of it. What happened that day?" Jose hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. "I told you," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Helen and I weren't together. She didn't show up. She must have gone somewhere else, but I have no idea where. Where did you go after you were supposed to meet her?" Perez pressed. Jose swallowed hard before answering. "I went to meet some friends. I had a drink. That's all. I don't know what happened after that. She wasn't answering her phone, and I thought maybe she just got distracted, but I never heard from her again." "Distracted?" Perez repeated, narrowing his eyes. "Is that all? Because that doesn't sound like the Helen I'm hearing about, from her family. She wouldn't just vanish without a word." Jose shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't know what else to say," he muttered. "Maybe she just left on her own. It happens." "No, Jose," Perez said, leaning forward. "This isn't something that just happens. Someone is hiding something, and I'm going to find out what it is." He stood, signaling that the conversation was over for now. As he walked out of the house, he felt the weight of Jose's gaze on his back. But Perez wasn't done yet. He had a gut feeling that this wasn't just a case of a simple disappearance. Something darker was unfolding, and he was going to make sure every piece fell into place. The next step in the investigation came later that afternoon. Detective Perez was at the local precinct, reviewing the evidence again. The fabric scrap found under Helen's seat in her car had been sent to the lab for analysis. A part of Perez hoped it was just a piece of cloth from her belongings, but deep down, he knew the bloodstains were a clear sign that something terrible had happened. If it was indeed blood, it meant Helen hadn't left of her own accord. The realization hit Perez like a cold Wi-Fi. This wasn't just a missing person case anymore. This was murder. With that thought, Perez knew the investigation was about to take a more urgent turn. He had to act quickly before the trail went cold, before any more pieces of the puzzle were hidden. He called in the team, preparing for the next phase of the investigation, finding the truth, no matter what it took. As he dialed the number for the lab, he glanced at the case file one last time. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the truth still felt miles away. And he knew one thing for sure. It was only going to get darker from here. April 10th, 221. The investigation into Helen Arias's disappearance had reached a new, unsettling level. The discovery of the blood-stained fabric scrap under her seat was no longer just a clue. It was evidence that something far more sinister had occurred. Detective Perez sat at his desk, the case file open in front of him, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align in a way he hadn't anticipated. The lab results had come in. The fabric did indeed contain traces of blood, and preliminary tests confirmed it wasn't Helen's. That fact alone pushed the case into a new direction. Helen hadn't just disappeared. She had been attacked. Perez felt a sharp pang of urgency. The case was no longer a simple missing persons report. It was now a potential homicide. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. Helen's family had been asking questions, demanding answers, and now he needed to provide them with something something tangible. The first step was clear. It was time to confront Jose again. That afternoon, Perez returned to the Bodia house. Jose had been cooperative before, but the detective could tell that the man was hiding something. The calm demeanor, the lack of urgency, it all felt off. Jose's story wasn't adding up, and Perez wasn't about to let him off the hook. He knocked on the door, and when it opened, Jose greeted him with a tight smile. "Detective Perez, back again?" "Yeah. I need to talk to you some more, Jose," Perez replied, his voice steady but firm. "It's about Helen. Things are getting more serious now, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Jose's face tightened for a moment, but he quickly masked his emotions. "I've told you everything I know. She disappeared, and I don't know where she went." Perez stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. It was quiet, eerily so. The house felt cold, even though the sun was setting outside. "The thing is, Jose," Perez began, his voice low, "we found something in Helen's car. A piece of fabric. We ran tests, and it has blood on it. Not Helen's blood, someone else's, and I need to know what happened." Jose's face went pale. His mouth went dry as he tried to speak, but the words didn't come out at first. After a long pause, he finally managed to stammer. "What? What are you talking about? I didn't hurt her. I didn't do anything to her." "Then explain the fabric, Jose," Perez said, keeping his tone level. "Why was there blood in Helen's car? Why did her phone go silent after she arrived in Prao de Aspina? This doesn't make sense. You're the last one who saw her, and now we're getting evidence that suggests something violent happened." Jose backed away slightly, his eyes darting to the side as if searching for an escape. "I don't know. I don't know what happened to her. I haven't seen her since that morning." Perez could feel the lie hanging in the air, thick and suffocating. The detective stepped closer, not backing down. "You're not being honest, Jose. If you know something, now's the time to tell me. We're not playing games here. Helen is missing, and I need to know the truth." Jose looked at the ground, his fists clenching and unclenching as though fighting with himself. "I don't know where she is, okay?" he repeated, his voice wavering now. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Perez raised an eyebrow, a slow realization creeping in. He took a step forward, keeping his eyes fixed on Jose. "What do you mean by that, Jose? What happened?" Jose's lips trembled, and for a moment, it looked like he was going to break down. But then he composed himself, looking up at Perez with a defeated expression. "I didn't want to hurt her, but she wanted to leave. She was going to leave me for good, and I couldn't take it. I don't know what happened after that. I just lost control." Perez's heart sank as he heard the words. It wasn't just a missing person case anymore. It was a crime of passion, a tragic mistake that spiraled into something much darker. But Perez knew that this confession wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. "I need you to come with me, Jose," Perez said, his voice low and steady. the weight of the situation settling in. We're going to get to the bottom of this. And you're going to help me find out what really happened to Helen. April 11th, 2021. Jose's confession had shaken the case to its core. But as Detective Perez left the Boadia house with Jose in tow, he felt a sense of unease settle over him. It didn't make sense. The details Jose had provided were vague at best, and his admission of guilt felt half-hearted, like he was covering for something or someone. Perez couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than Jose was letting on. The blood found in Helen's car, the fabric scrap, the inconsistency in Jose's statements, it all pointed to a carefully constructed lie. But why? At the station, Perez sat with Jose in the interrogation room. The air was thick with tension as the detective flipped through the case file, eyes scanning the notes. His mind raced eastward, trying to connect the dots. Jose had confessed to losing control, but Perez couldn't believe it was as simple as that. There was too much at stake. There had to be more. Jose, Perez said, his voice calm but firm. We need to go over this again. I'm not buying the story you're telling me. You need to be honest with me, completely honest. I know you are hiding something. Jose shifted in his seat, his hands trembling slightly. His eyes darted around the room before meeting Perez's gaze. I told you everything I know, he muttered, his voice shaky. Helen was going to leave me. She was moving on, and I didn't want that to happen. Perez leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. And then what? You lost control. You think that's going to be enough to explain what happened to Helen? Jose swallowed hard, his breath coming in short gasps. I didn't mean for it to happen. I never wanted to hurt her. His voice cracked as he continued. We argued. She was leaving. And then I don't know, I lost my temper. And the next thing I knew, she wasn't there anymore. Perez's patience was running thin. That's not good enough, Jose. You need to tell me what happened. Where did you go after you argued with her? And why didn't you call for help if something went wrong? Why didn't you report it? Jose looked down at his hands, his face pale. He didn't respond immediately, but after a long silence, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I never called for help because I didn't know what to do. I thought if I just let it go, everything would be okay. But now everything's falling apart. I can't keep pretending. I didn't hurt her on purpose. I just didn't know how to make her stay. Perez stood up, pacing around the room. He could feel the weight of the case pressing on him. There was something deeply wrong about this entire situation, something Jose wasn't saying. Perez's instincts told him that Jose had a much larger role in Helen's fate than he was letting on. But he didn't have enough to press him further. Not yet. The detective leaned against the table, his arms crossed. You say you didn't mean to hurt her. But you still haven't explained what happened after she disappeared. Why did you wait so long to contact her family? Why didn't you try to help find her? Jose's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, Perez saw a glimpse of genuine remorse. But it wasn't enough. I couldn't explain it. I just didn't know what to say. I was scared. I thought if I just waited, everything would go back to normal. Perez wasn't convinced. So you waited. You waited while Helen was out there, gone. And you did nothing? Jose hung his head. I didn't know what to do. I was afraid. Perez pressed on, his voice steady, but filled with an edge of anger. You're going to tell me everything, Jose. I'm not walking away from this until I know exactly what happened. At that moment, the door to the interrogation room opened, and another officer stepped in, holding a stack of papers. Detective, the officer said, the lab results came back. We ran the blood tests on the fabric from Helen's car. It's definitely not hers. Perez's heart sank. He'd been afraid of this. The implications were clear. Helen hadn't just left. She hadn't disappeared willingly. Someone had made sure she was silenced. And it wasn't just a lover's quarrel. Who does it belong to? Perez asked, his voice hard. The officer looked at the papers. It matches a blood sample from Andrea Boedia, Jose's sister. Perez's mind raced. Andrea Boedia. This was the first he was hearing of her involvement. But it made sense. She was close to Jose, part of the family. And if there had been a cover-up, it would have been easy to overlook her role. Perez knew he had to find her, and he had to do it fast. Without another word, Perez turned to Jose. "Where is your sister, Jose?" Jose didn't answer immediately, but the guilt on his face was enough. "I don't know. She doesn't live here anymore. She left after everything happened." Perez's blood ran cold. He needed to find Andrea, and he needed to do it quickly. He wasn't sure how deep this conspiracy ran, but one thing was clear. Helen's disappearance was no accident, and the people closest to her were hiding something much darker. April 2021, Detective Perez stood at the edge of the small town, staring at the Boedia house from a distance. The unsettling revelation about Andrea Boedia's blood being found in Helen's car had shattered the case wide open. He couldn't shake the thought of the Boedia family's role in what had happened to Helen. Was Jose really the only one involved? Or was Andrea just as guilty? It was time to press forward, with a renewed sense of urgency. The investigation had already taken its darkest turn, but Perez knew they were still far from uncovering the full truth. With Andrea's blood linking her to the scene, it became clear that the case wasn't going to end with just Jose. Perez needed to find Andrea, and he needed to find her fast. He gathered his team and briefed them. "We're looking for Andrea Boedia. She's the key to unlocking the rest of this case. Her blood was found at the scene. She's been hiding something, and I believe she's the missing link we need." The team sprang into action, reaching out to local contacts and checking any potential places where Andrea might be hiding. Perez was relentless, reviewing every piece of evidence again: witness statements, phone records, Jose's inconsistencies, and now Andrea's potential involvement. It all led back to the Boedia family, and one thing was certain. Someone in that family knew exactly what happened to Helen. By mid-afternoon, Perez received a tip. Andrea had been spotted in a small village just outside of Prao de Aspina, far from her family's home. It was a lead he couldn't ignore. Perez and a team of officers arrived at the village by early evening, a quiet, rural area far from the usual bustle. The small town felt deserted, the streets silent, but Perez's instincts told him they were getting close. As they knocked on doors, questioning residents, one man mentioned seeing a woman matching Andrea's description at an abandoned farmhouse just outside town. It was a long shot, but Perez knew they had to check. The team followed the man's directions, driving out toward the edge of the village. The farmhouse was old, neglected, with weeds growing around it, and the roof sagging from years of neglect. As they pulled up, Perez's heart raced. There was something about the place that felt wrong. His instinct screamed that they were about to find what they had been searching for. Perez stepped out of the car, motioning for his team to follow. The door to the farmhouse was cracked open, and inside, the air was thick with dust. The team moved cautiously, clearing the rooms one by one. But there was no sign of Andrea. Just as they were about to leave, one of the officers spotted something. A piece of cloth, caught on a broken door frame. Perez approached, inspecting the fabric. It was the same dark fabric found in Helen's car. It was stained with blood. "Get ready," Perez muttered. "She's here." The officers fanned out, and they entered the back room of the farmhouse. There, sitting in the corner, was Andrea Boadia. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, as if she had been waiting there for them. She didn't make a move to escape. "Andrea Boadia," Perez said, his voice cold. "You're under arrest for the disappearance of Helena Rios and for obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent." Andrea didn't resist. She didn't say a word, but her eyes filled with tears. It was clear she knew this moment had been coming. Perez felt a momentary flash of pity, but it quickly passed. He had to stay focused. They had come this far, and there was no turning back. Back at the station, Andrea sat in the interrogation room, her hands trembling as she stared at the table. Perez wasted no time. "You were involved in this from the beginning, weren't you?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "You were there when it happened. You know exactly what happened to Helen." Andrea didn't speak at first, her lips trembling as she fought back tears. Perez waited, allowing the silence to settle in, giving her the space she needed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," she said, her words broken. "We didn't mean to hurt her. It was supposed to be a warning, but it got out of hand." Perez leaned forward. "A warning for what?" Andrea looked up at him, her eyes filled with regret. "Helen was going to ruin everything. She was going to take Jose away from us. She was going to leave him, and we couldn't let that happen. We tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen. So, you and Jose?" Perez interrupted. Andrea nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, we just wanted her to stay. But when she wouldn't listen, we didn't know what to do. I never meant for it to end this way." Perez's stomach churned. He had suspected that the Boadia family had something to hide. But hearing Andrea confess to her role in Helen's death sent a wave of disgust over him. "I didn't kill her," Andrea said, her voice cracking. "Jose did. I helped him. But I didn't know what else to do. He didn't stop. He wouldn't stop." Perez felt his heart sink. This was it. The full confession. The pieces had finally come together. He knew Jose had been involved, but hearing Andrea's role made everything clearer. The tragic, senseless murder of Helen Arias wasn't just a random act. It was a desperate attempt to control a situation, and in the end, it cost them everything. April 30th, 2021. The weight of Andrea's confession hung heavily in the air. The pieces of the puzzle had finally fallen into place, but the truth was still deeply unsettling. Jose had gone from a person of interest to a full-fledged suspect, and now Andrea, his own sister, had admitted to playing a key role in Helen's death. Detective Perez sat in the interrogation room, reviewing the evidence once again, trying to make sense of everything. Andrea's statement had confirmed what Perez had suspected all along. Helen's murder had been a result of desperation, control, and twisted emotions. The motives were rooted in a toxic relationship, one that had festered for months, maybe even years. Jose's unspoken jealousy, Andrea's desire to protect him, and the overwhelming pressure that both had placed on Helen had led to this tragedy. Perez was done with the questions. He knew enough now to charge both Jose and Andrea, but the question that still lingered in his mind was why. Why had they gone to such extreme lengths to stop someone from leaving a toxic relationship? And why had they gone so far to cover it up? There was more to this story. It was time to confront Jose. That evening, Perez met with his team to prepare for their next move. They would need to arrest Jose now that they had Andrea's confession. But Perez wasn't going to take any chances. He needed to make sure they had everything locked down before they made their move. Jose was dangerous, unpredictable, and now, after hearing Andrea's confession, Perez knew that he wasn't working alone. The Boadia family had been covering up for each other, and Perez needed to expose the entire truth. As the team gathered in the briefing room, Perez laid out the plan. "We'll move on Jose tonight," he said. "He's the key to understanding this whole thing, and we need him to confirm what Andrea's told us. But I want everyone to be prepared. He's not going down without a fight." They all nodded, their expressions grim but determined. Perez knew this wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way forward. With Andrea's statement and the blood evidence they'd collected, they had enough to bring Jose in. Perez just had to make sure they could get him to talk. Hours later, Perez stood outside the Boadia family home again. The house, quiet and still under the cover of darkness, felt more ominous than ever. Perez's gut told him that they were closing in on the end of the case, but something deep inside him still felt uneasy. There was a nagging feeling that Jose knew more than he was letting on, and Perez wasn't about to let him slip through his fingers. He motioned for his team to move in, and they quietly approached the house, surrounding it with precision. Perez rang the doorbell, his hand steady as he waited for the inevitable confrontation. Moments later, Jose appeared at the door, his expression unchanged. "Detective," he said, his voice almost too calm. "I knew you'd be back." "Jose, we need to talk," Perez replied, his voice cold and unwavering. "We have enough to charge you, and now's the time to come clean. You're under arrest for the murder of Helen Arias." Jose didn't resist. He didn't even flinch. "I already told you everything," he said, his tone eerily calm. "There's nothing more to say." Perez stepped forward. "No, Jose. There's more. There's always more. And I'm going to make sure you tell me the whole truth." Back at the station, Perez sat across from Jose in the interrogation room. The tension was palpable, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Perez didn't waste time. He had his team search Jose's house while they continued questioning him. They would find more evidence, but Perez needed to get to the heart of the matter. "Jose," Perez began, his voice measured, "we know what happened. We know about your argument with Helen. We know about the blood. And we know about Andrea. You don't get to hide anymore. You're going to tell me what happened that day. How did it escalate to murder?" Jose's gaze remained fixed on the table, his fingers nervously tapping it. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "She wouldn't listen. I loved her, you know? I did. I never wanted to hurt her. But she was leaving. She was taking everything, my family, my future, and she was just walking away. I couldn't stand it. I didn't know what to do." Perez leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "So you killed her because she wanted to leave? You couldn't handle losing her? That's why you're sitting here now?" Jose's voice gasped, and for the first time, Perez saw something real: fear. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted her to stay. I didn't know how to make her stay. And then it just happened. I couldn't stop." Perez listened closely, his mind racing. "What happened after that, Jose? What did you do with her body?" Jose shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "I didn't know what to do. I panicked. Andrea helped me hide it. We couldn't let anyone know. We couldn't let the family know. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't mean to kill her. But I did." Perez's stomach turned. The confession wasn't enough. The truth was still buried deep, and Perez knew that they weren't getting the whole story yet. Jose's confession, while damning, only raised more questions. Perez stood up, his gaze fixed on Jose. "You're not done talking, Jose. Not by a long shot. And I'll make sure the truth comes out, every last detail." April 14th, 2021. The confession had been difficult to hear. But Detective Perez wasn't ready to let Jose's words be the final truth. Something about the whole case felt incomplete. As he sat in the interrogation room, his mind ran through the details again. Andrea's involvement, the blood evidence, Jose's confession. Yet, it all seemed too neatly packaged. Perez had been in this line of work long enough to know that when things seemed too clear, it was often a sign that something else was being hidden. He stared at Jose, who now sat with his head hung low, his body slumped in defeat. For a brief moment, Perez almost felt sympathy for the man. But that sympathy vanished the second Jose spoke again, his voice small and fragile. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said, barely able to meet Perez's eyes. "It was just supposed to be a fight. I never thought it would end like this." Perez leaned forward, his voice low but commanding. "But it did, Jose. And now you need to explain why you thought it was so safe to take matters into your own hands. Why didn't you just let her go? Why did you feel the need to control her so much? What drove you to the point of murder?" Jose swallowed hard, his eyes welling with tears again. "She was leaving me," he repeated, his voice cracking. "And I couldn't take it. She was everything to me. I didn't know how to stop her. And Andrea, she didn't want to lose me either. We both thought that if we could just get her to stay, everything would be okay." Perez's frustration boiled over. "You think murder was the answer? Do you think that's what she deserved?" Jose's face twisted in agony as he nodded slowly. "I don't know. It's a blur. Everything happened so fast. And when I realized what I'd done, it was too late." Perez stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "That's not good enough, Jose. That's never going to be good enough. I need more from you. I need you to tell me what happened that afternoon. Everything. Where did you take her body?" Jose flinched at the question, as if the memory was too much to bear. We didn't know what to do. Andrea helped me. We knew we had to hide it, make it look like she'd just left on her own. We put her in the car and drove out to the woods. We thought, if we just left her there, no one would ever find her." Perez clenched his fists, trying to control the rising anger. "You thought if you just left her in the woods, everything would be fine. You took her life, Jose, and then you just abandoned her? You've got to be kidding me." Jose didn't respond. He sat there, his hands trembling in his lap, his face drained of all color. The confession had come in waves, each sentence harder to stomach than the last. And yet Perez knew it wasn't over. There was still so much more to uncover. Andrea's role, what had happened after Helen's body was left in the woods. These were the pieces that still needed to fit together. Hours passed before Perez finally left the interrogation room. The air outside was thick with tension. His team had gone over the new evidence, and they were preparing to search the woods where Jose and Andrea had discarded Helen's body. It was the only lead left, the final piece of the puzzle. But even as he prepared for the next phase of the investigation, Perez couldn't shake the feeling that there was they were missing. It wasn't just the murder, it was the family dynamic, the deep-rooted need to control, to manipulate. What had driven them to this point? He had no answers, but he knew they were getting closer. His instincts told him that the truth was more complex than any of them had imagined. He needed to find Andrea again. She was the missing link, the one who might finally explain it all. The next day, Perez and his team arrived at the woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the landscape. They spread out, each officer carefully scanning the ground for any signs that could lead them to Helen's final resting place. The search was slow, methodical, and silent. There was a palpable sense of dread in the air. But Perez pushed forward, determined to find the answers. After several hours of searching, one of the officers called out, his voice breaking the silence. "Detective, we found something." Perez hurried over to where the officers stood. Beneath a tangle of underbrush, they had uncovered a shallow grave. The ground had been disturbed, the earth uneven, as if something or someone had been hastily buried. The officer carefully cleared the dirt, revealing a body wrapped in a piece of cloth. It was Helen. Perez stood frozen for a moment, staring at the sight. He had hoped, against hope, that they would find something that would change the outcome. But there was no miracle here, only a tragic end to a life that had been cut short by the hands of those who were supposed to care for her most. "Get the forensics team here," Perez ordered, his voice steady, despite the storm of emotions inside him. "We need to secure everything. This case is far from over." April 15th, 2021, the discovery of Helen Arias's body had sent a shockwave through the investigation. Perez stood over the shallow grave, watching as forensics carefully documented every inch of the scene. The evidence was irrefutable now. Helen had been murdered, and the suspects were clear. But there was still so much more to unravel. Jose had confessed, but Andrea's role was still unclear. The motive was still clouded in confusion. And Perez couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper at play. This wasn't just about love and jealousy. It was about control, manipulation, and something far darker lurking beneath the surface. As the forensics team worked, Perez stood apart, his mind racing through the details once more. Jose had claimed to be the one who had killed Helen, but Andrea's blood on the fabric scrap in her car was undeniable. Why had she been so involved? What had driven her to help her brother cover up a murder? Perez walked back to his car, pulling out his phone. He needed to get in touch with Andrea again. They were going to need her to fill in the blanks. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that getting Andrea to talk wasn't going to be easy. She was hiding something, and Perez knew that the truth, no matter how ugly, had to come out. At the station, Perez sat in his office, reviewing the statements they had gathered from the family. The timeline was clear. Helen had left Wedo in the morning, headed for Prao de Ospina, and after that, the trail went cold. Jose's account of the day didn't add up, and Andrea's involvement raised more questions than it answered. Perez needed to put the pressure on. He stood up and grabbed his jacket. It was time to pay Andrea a visit. The discovery of Helen's body had given him the leverage he needed. No more lies, no more evasions. It was time to confront her with the reality of what they had found. The drive to the small house where Andrea was staying felt longer than it actually was. The air was thick with anticipation, and Perez's mind kept returning to the key question. What was Andrea hiding? When Perez arrived, the house was quiet. A few lights flickered in the windows, but it looked like no one was home. He knocked on the door, his hand steady. Moments later, Andrea opened it, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. "I didn't think you'd be back," she said quietly, stepping aside to let Perez in. Her voice was thin, shaky, but there was an edge to it, a quiet defiance that Perez couldn't ignore. "I'm not leaving until I have the full story," Perez said, his voice firm. "We found her, Andrea. We found Helen's body. It's over now." Andrea flinched, her eyes darting to the floor. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. "I didn't want this. I didn't want any of it." Perez stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "Then tell me what happened, Andrea. Why did you help him? Why did you cover for Jose? You didn't just help him hide it. You helped him kill her. You both did." Andrea's lips trembled, and for a moment, Perez thought she might break down. But instead, she stood there, her body rigid, as if trying to brace herself against the truth. "We didn't mean to," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Jose was losing control. He was so angry. I thought I could stop him. I thought if I helped him, we could fix it. We could make it go away. Perez shook his head. By killing her? Andrea's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Perez saw the weight of the guilt on her face. I never wanted her to die, she said, her voice cracking. She was just going to leave, and I couldn't. I couldn't let her take him away. I couldn't let her ruin everything. I thought if we just made her stay, everything would be okay. Perez took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. But you didn't make her stay, did you? You killed her, both of you. And now you have to live with that. Andrea collapsed into a chair, her face in her hands. The tears flowed freely now. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. I didn't think it would go this far. But once it did, I couldn't go back. I couldn't let anyone know the truth. And now I'm the one who has to live with it. Perez stood there, watching her, the full weight of the situation sinking in. Andrea wasn't just an accomplice. She had been complicit in every part of it. But there was something else in her confession, something Perez couldn't quite place. He needed to push further. Andrea, tell me about the day it happened. What exactly went down? Andrea wiped her tears away, her face pale and drawn. She looked up at Perez with hollow eyes. We argued. Jose and I. We were trying to talk her out of leaving, but she wouldn't listen. She was so determined. I was trying to convince her, but she just kept saying she was done. She was leaving for good. And then, her voice broke again. Then it just happened. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop him. Perez listened closely as Andrea spoke, piecing together the details of the day. The argument, the heated words, the fear that had gripped both her and Jose. And then, the loss of control. It was all too clear now. Helen hadn't just disappeared. She had been murdered out of fear and desperation. April 16th, 2021, the confession from Andrea had cracked open the case. But even as Detective Perez left her house, the weight of her words hung heavily in his mind. She had admitted to helping Jose in the murder of Helen Arias, but Perez still felt there was more to the story. He couldn't let it go, not when the truth felt just out of reach. He had been trained to recognize when a story was incomplete, when someone was holding back, and Andrea's confession, while damning, felt like only half of the puzzle. Perez knew it wasn't over. He still needed to understand the full scope of the crime. The next morning, Perez returned to the station, his mind racing through the details of the case. He reviewed the files once more, retracing every step, every piece of evidence, every conversation. There was one thing that kept coming back to him: the blood found in Helen's car. Andrea had admitted her involvement, but Perez still hadn't uncovered the full picture of what happened after Helen's death. How had they disposed of the body? Why had they thought they could get away with it? And why had Jose been so adamant about covering up the crime? Perez decided to dig deeper into Jose's background. He needed to understand what motivated him. The investigation had already revealed a strained relationship between him and Helen. But was there more? What had really pushed him over the edge? As Perez sat at his desk, his phone buzzed. It was an update from the forensics team. Detective, we've got something new on the blood. The DNA analysis came back. It's not just Andrea's blood in the car. There's a third party involved. Perez's heart skipped a beat. A third party? He quickly dialed the number of the forensics team leader, his mind already racing with possibilities. Who's the third party? Perez asked, his voice tight. We're still running the analysis, but it's someone connected to Jose. We're tracking it down now. We'll need a few more hours. Perez stood up, his heart pounding. A third party could mean anything. Someone else was involved. And it wasn't just the Boadia siblings. The implications were staggering. Perez could feel the case slipping from his grasp, every answer raising more questions. He paced the room, his thoughts spinning. If there was someone else involved, it could change everything. He needed to get back to Jose. He had to know who else was part of the conspiracy. Perez couldn't waste another minute. That afternoon, Perez arrived at the Boadia house once again. He rang the doorbell, his mind focused on the new piece of the puzzle. When Jose opened the door, his face fell. The calm, collected demeanor he had shown before was gone. Now he seemed rattled, his eyes darting nervously. "Detective," Jose said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What now?" "We've found something," Perez said, keeping his tone firm. "We know there is someone else involved, someone connected to you. We need you to tell me who it is, now." Jose hesitated, his face growing paler by the second. "I don't know what you're talking about. There's no one else." Perez took a step forward, his voice steady but sharp. "You can't lie to me anymore, Jose. There's another person, and I want to know who they are." Jose's eyes flickered, his hands trembling. For a moment, it seemed like he might crumble under the pressure. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and filled with dread. "It was Raul. My friend Raul. He helped us. He was the one who he helped with the body." Perez froze. Raul? The name didn't sound familiar, but it didn't matter. The confession was enough. The pieces were finally falling into place. Jose, Andrea, and now Raul. They had all been part of the plan to hide Helen's death. "Where is he, Jose?" Perez asked. "Where can I find him?" Jose's face darkened. "I don't know where he is. After everything happened, he disappeared. He knew we were in too deep. He was skewed." Perez's mind raced. Raul had been involved in hiding the body, and now he was on the run. Perez couldn't let him slip away. They had to find him, and they had to find him fast. That night, Perez's team launched a manhunt for Raul. They followed every lead, checked every possible hiding place, and contacted Raul's known associates. As the hours passed, Perez felt the pressure mounting. He couldn't let Raul get away. The case had already cost Helen her life, and now it was about to cost Raul his freedom. It wasn't until the early morning hours that they found him, hiding out in a rundown apartment on the outskirts of town. When the police closed in, Raul didn't resist. He came out of the building slowly, his face hollow, his expression defeated. Back at the station, Raul sat in the interrogation room, his eyes vacant as Perez entered. He said nothing at first, his hands trembling as he looked up at the detective. "You're under arrest for the murder of Helen Arias," Perez said, his voice calm, but filled with authority. "You have the right to remain silent." Raul didn't speak for a long while, his eyes staring blankly ahead. But when he finally spoke, his voice was shaky. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Raul said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to help. I didn't want anyone to get hurt." Perez leaned forward. "You helped hide a body, Raul. You helped murder an innocent woman. Don't act like this is some mistake." Raul looked down, tears welling up in his eyes. "I never thought it would go this far. I was just trying to protect my friends. I thought it was the only way." Perez didn't respond. He just sat there, waiting for Raul to say more. But the confession wasn't enough. It never was. Perez knew that this case had only just begun, and there was still so much left to uncover. April 17th, 2021, with Raul in custody, Detective Perez finally had all three individuals connected to Helen Arias's murder: Jose, Andrea, and now Raul. The investigation had reached its most critical juncture. Perez had always suspected that there was more to the story, that the Boadia family's involvement went deeper than a simple lover's quarrel. And now, with Raul's confession, the dark truth about the lengths they had gone to in order to conceal the crime was coming to light. But there was still one major question lingering. Why? Why had they resorted to such drastic measures to keep Helen from leaving, to keep her from walking away from Jose? Perez sat at his desk, staring at the case file. Jose, Andrea, and Raul had all confessed, but there was still so much more to understand. The investigation had made it clear that this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. It had been premeditated. There was a level of planning that went beyond what Perez had expected. It wasn't just jealousy or love. It was about control. It was about power. And that power had led to murder. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Perez looked up as his partner, Detective Rosa Vega, entered the office holding a stack of papers in her hands. She had been working on the forensic side of the case, while Perez focused on the interviews. "Detective," Rosa began, her tone serious, "we've got the final report back from the forensics team. There's something you need to see." Perez stood and walked over to her desk. He watched as Rosa spread the documents out before him, a sense of unease settling over him. "This is the final autopsy report for Helen Arias," Rosa said. "The cause of death was asphyxiation, and based on the evidence, it seems like she was unconscious when it happened. The head injury she sustained wasn't fatal, but it likely caused her to lose consciousness, making it easier for her attacker to strangle her. The most disturbing part of this is that the forensic team found signs of defensive wounds on Helen's hands. She fought back. She didn't go down without a struggle." Perez felt his stomach turn. The idea that Helen had fought for her life, only to be silenced in the end, was unbearable. It painted a picture of a woman who had been desperate to survive, desperate to escape from the people she trusted. Jose, Andrea, and Raul had taken that hope away from her. And the fact that they had tried to cover it all up, to pretend that nothing had happened, made it all the more horrific, Rosa continued. "There's also something else. Blood was found under Helen's fingernails. It doesn't match Andrea, but it does match Jose. It's possible that she scratched him during the struggle." Perez ran his hand over his face, frustration rising within him. "We knew Jose was involved, but now we have the physical evidence to back it up. They tried to make it look like an accident, but it's clear now that Helen never had a chance." Rosa nodded. "And there's more. The toxicology report came back clean. No drugs, no alcohol in her system. This wasn't a crime of passion fueled by substance abuse. This was cold, calculated. It was a deliberate act." Perez closed his eyes for a moment, trying to absorb it all. They were scared of losing control. That's what this was about. Jose was desperate to keep Helen from leaving. Andrea was just as invested in keeping the family together, even if it meant destroying someone else's life. The door to the office opened, and one of the officers stepped in. "Detective, we've got another update. We just got a lead on Raul's whereabouts before he went into hiding." Perez turned sharply. "What do you mean?" "We traced his phone records. He made several calls from a burner phone, but one of the numbers stood out. It's linked to a known associate of his, someone who has a history of involvement with organized crime in the area. We think Raul may have had outside help after the murder." Perez's eyes narrowed. This case was about to get even more complicated. "Where is this person now?" Perez asked, his voice urgent. "We're tracking them down as we speak, but we think Raul reached out to this individual for assistance in covering up the murder." Perez stood up, his mind racing. "We need to get to Raul, now." The interrogation room felt colder than usual, as Raul sat slumped in his chair, his eyes glazed over. Perez and Rosa entered, closing the door behind them. Raul had been quiet for most of the day, his previous defiance now replaced with a sense of resignation. Raul, Perez began, his voice calm but firm. We have your confession. But there's more to this than just what you've told us. We know you didn't act alone. We know you reached out to someone for help. Tell us who it was, and we can make sure you were treated fairly. Otherwise, you're looking at even more charges. Raul didn't respond immediately, but his lips trembled. Finally, he spoke in a low voice. I didn't want to get anyone else involved. I didn't want to drag anyone else into this mess. But I called him. I called Tony. Tony was the one who helped me get rid of the body. He said we needed to hide it, make it look like she just left. He gave me the burner phone to use. Perez's pulse quickened. Tony. The name didn't sound familiar, but Perez knew that this could be the missing link they needed. If Tony was involved, it meant the cover-up was far more extensive than they had thought. Tony? Perez repeated. What's his full name? Where can we find him? Raul shook his head, his voice shaking. I don't know his full name. I just know him as Tony. He's been helping with stuff for a while. I swear, I didn't want to hurt anyone else. But Helen, she was going to ruin everything. And Jose, he didn't want to lose her. I just thought I was helping. Perez took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He wasn't finished with Raul yet, but this was a breakthrough. If they could find Tony, they could sequel the last loose end. They could finally close this case. So April 18th, 2021, the investigation had taken a dark turn. With Raul's confession and his mention of Tony, the case now had a new lead. The sense of urgency in the air was palpable, as Detective Perez and his team worked tirelessly to track down Tony, the mysterious figure who had helped Raul cover up the murder of Helen Arias. The investigation that had begun as a missing persons case had now spiraled into a complex web of lies, manipulation, and murder. The family ties that had seemed so strong were now the very thing that had allowed this tragedy to unfold. Perez knew he couldn't waste any more time. Tony was the key to uncovering the full extent of the crime. Perez's phone buzzed on his desk, interrupting his thoughts. It was the officer assigned to track down Tony's whereabouts. Perez answered the call immediately. We've located him, the officer said. Tony is staying at an apartment on the edge of town. We're monitoring his movements, but we think we've found the place. Perez felt a surge of adrenaline. Get the team ready. We move in now. Within minutes, the team was in position, ready to confront Tony and bring him into custody. Perez sat in the car, his mind racing. Every moment they spent waiting felt like an eternity. The pieces of the case were starting to fall into place, but they were still missing the full picture. Why had Tony been involved? What exactly had he done to help cover up Helen's murder? And what other connections did he have to the Bodia family? The apartment complex Tony was staying at was quiet, its dimly lit hallways giving off an air of desolation. Perez and his team moved in swiftly, taking positions outside Tony's door. They could hear movement inside, but no voices. Perez nodded at his team, signaling them to proceed. The door was kicked in, and the team rushed inside, guns drawn and ready for anything. The apartment was sparsely furnished, with only a few items scattered around. Tony was sitting on a couch in the living room, staring blankly at the wall. His expression was vacant, almost detached from the world around him. He didn't even flinch when the officers entered. Tony D'Amico, Perez said, his voice cold and firm. You're under arrest for the murder of Helen Arias and for aiding in the cover-up of the crime. You have the right to remain silent. Tony slowly turned his head, his eyes meeting Perez's for the first time. I didn't want this, Tony whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Perez stepped closer, his eyes narrowed. Then why did you help Raul and Jose? Why did you cover up a murder? Tony sighed deeply, his gaze shifting downward. I didn't know what else to do. I was just trying to help. Raoul came to me, told me what happened, and said he needed help. I thought it was just going to be a small favor, something simple. But when we went out to the woods, I saw what they did. It wasn't just a fight anymore. They killed her. And I helped. Perez's heart sank. The truth was finally coming out. But it was worse than he had feared. The murder had been premeditated. Raoul had gone to Tony for help, and Tony had agreed, knowing that what they were about to do was wrong, but unable to stop himself. He had participated in the cover-up, and now he was confessing to his role in the crime. Why didn't you come forward earlier? Perez asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Why didn't you say anything? Tony looked up at Perez, his eyes filled with guilt. I was scared. I didn't want to get involved. I didn't want to go to prison. But after everything that happened, I couldn't live with myself. I knew I had to tell the truth. Perez took a deep breath, trying to maintain control. You should have done the right thing from the start, Tony. But now, you're going to face the consequences of your actions. Later that evening, back at the station, Perez sat with his team, reviewing the case one last time. With Tony in custody and his confession on record, the investigation was finally reaching its conclusion. They had the full story now. Jose, Andrea, and Raoul had all been complicit in Helen's murder. And Tony, though not the primary actor, had played a significant role in covering up the crime. The truth had come to light, but the cost had been immeasurable. Perez stood up, his mind heavy with the weight of the case. He had seen cases like this before, families torn apart by violence, lives ruined by a single moment of uncontrolled anger. But this case felt different. The betrayal between Jose and Helen, the manipulation by Andrea, and the desperation by Raoul had all led to a tragic ending. Perez walked to the window, looking out over the city. It was a quiet evening, the streets empty, but his mind was still racing. There would be more questions to answer, more investigations to conduct, but for now, they had the answers they needed. The truth had come out. The next day, the trial would begin. But for Perez, the work wasn't over. There would always be more cases, more questions, more lives affected. But this one would stay with him. April 19th, 2021, the trial of Jose, Andrea, Raoul, and Tony began. And for Detective Perez, it felt like the final chapter in a long and exhausting investigation. After months of searching for the truth, the case was now in the hands of the courts. Perez sat in the courtroom, watching as the defense and prosecution laid out their arguments. Jose and Andrea sat stoically, their faces pale as the evidence against them was presented. Raoul, who had already confessed to his part in the cover-up, seemed overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. And Tony, once a figure on the periphery of the case, now stood as a key figure in the conspiracy to hide the murder. The trial had been long, the evidence overwhelming, but Perez still couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more beneath the surface. He had spent months combing through the details, speaking with witnesses, and piecing together the timeline of events. Yet as he sat in the courtroom, he felt a sense of detachment from it all. The investigation had consumed him, and now that it was over, he was left to process the aftermath. The courtroom was filled with a quiet murmur as the prosecutor stood and addressed the jury. This is not just a case of murder. This is a case of control, manipulation, and betrayal. Helen Arias was taken from us, not just because of a lover's quarrel, but because two people, Jose and Andrea Boadia, could not bear to let go of the toxic grip they had on her. They manipulated those around them, including Raoul and Tony, to cover up their crime. And in the end, it was their desperation and fear that led to the brutal death of an innocent woman. Perez watched as the prosecutor laid out the details of the case. The murder had been premeditated. The blood found in Helen's car, the defensive wounds she had sustained, the confessions from Jose, Andrea, and Raul of it pointed to the same conclusion. The Boadilla family was responsible for Helen's death. The prosecutor turned to face the jury. We may never know exactly what was said between Helen and her attackers in those final moments. But what we do know is that she fought for her life. And that fight was taken away from her by people she trusted, people she loved. And it is their actions that brought her to an undeniably and unjust end. Perez sat back in his seat, reflecting on the investigation. There were moments during the trial when he had to remind himself that the case was over. He had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. But now, as he listened to the prosecutor's words, he realized that no amount of justice would bring Helen back. The tragedy of it all was that a woman with so much promise had been cut down in the prime of her life. All because of fear. All because of control. Hours later, the jury returned their verdict. Jose and Andrea Boadilla were found guilty of first-degree murder, while Raul was convicted of aiding in the murder and participating in the cover-up. Tony, though not the instigator of the crime, was found guilty of obstruction of justice and aiding in the disposal of the body. Perez stood at the back of the courtroom as the verdicts were read aloud. He watched as the Boadilla family, once a tightly knit unit, was shattered forever. Jose and Andrea were escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, their faces stoic, as if they still couldn't comprehend the gravity of what they had done. Raul, who had already confessed, was led away in silence. Tony, the final piece of the puzzle, was sentenced for his role in helping cover up the crime. The trial was over, but for Perez, the weight of the case still lingered. He had solved the case, brought the truth to light, but it wasn't the kind of victory that brought satisfaction. It was a hollow win, one that didn't fill the emptiness left behind by Helen's death. Perez knew that the Boadilla family would never be the same. They had destroyed each other in the pursuit of control and power, and in the end, it was Helen who paid the price. As Perez walked out of the courtroom, he took a deep breath, the weight of the trial finally lifting. It was over, but the scars left by this case would remain with him. The lives that had been destroyed, the trust that had been broken, it was all too much to process in one sitting. But as he stepped into the cool air outside, Perez knew that he had done what he had set out to do. He had brought justice to Helen Arias, even if it wasn't the closure everyone had hoped for. April 20th, 2021, the aftermath of the trial was quiet. But for Detective Perez, the weight of the case lingered. The court's decision was final, but the emotional toll of the investigation had not been easy to shake off. Perez had solved the case. He had followed the trail, gathered the confessions, and seen it through to the bitter end. But Helen Arias was still gone, and that fact weighed heavily on him. As he sat at his desk going over the final reports from the trial, Perez couldn't stop thinking about how it all unfolded. The Boadilla family, Jose, Andrea, and Raul had been so close, and in a single moment of desperation and rage, it had all come crashing down. Perez had seen cases like this before: families torn apart by violence, friends turned on each other, and lives ruined in an instant. But this case, with its mix of betrayal, manipulation, and control, felt different. It was personal in a way that left him feeling drained. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His phone buzzed on his desk, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Rosa Vega, his partner, who had been working with him on the case from the beginning. "Detective, we've got some new information. You need to see this." Perez's heart sank. He had thought the case was closed, But Rosa's message was a reminder that there was always more lurking beneath the surface. He grabbed his phone and dialed her number. "Rosa," Perez said, his voice tense. "What's going on?" "Listen," Rosa replied. "We've been going through the Boadia family's finances, and there is something you need to see. We've found a connection, something that wasn't part of the investigation before. I think it might change everything." Perez's mind raced. "What kind of connection?" "I'll explain when you get here," Rosa said. "It's worth looking into. You might not want to miss this." Minutes later, Perez arrived at the stationway, where Rosa was waiting, with a stack of papers on her desk. He could tell by the look on her face that something serious was going on. "Here," Rosa said, handing him the files. "We started going through the Boadia family's financial records, bank statements, transactions, everything we could find. And we discovered something strange. It looks like Jose and Andrea were involved in more than just a fight over Helen. They were in debt, serious debt. And it wasn't just the kind of debt you rack up by living beyond your means. This was tied to illegal activity." Perez flipped through the papers, his eyes scanning the records. There were large withdrawals, payments to untraceable accounts, and a list of names that seemed out of place. "What are these?" he asked, pointing to the suspicious payments. Rosa nodded. "Those payments? They're tied to a series of loans from a local loan shark, someone who's been known to deal with people in desperate situations. We believe that Jose and Andrea were not just trying to control Helen. They were trying to keep up with the pressure of their debts. This wasn't just about love. It was about survival." Perez's stomach tightened. "You're saying they killed Helen because of money?" "It's looking that way," Rosa replied. "Helen was planning to leave Jose. That much we know. But what if she was also the only person who could have helped them get out of their financial hole? What if she was the key to everything?" Perez sat back, his mind reeling. The idea that the murder wasn't just about Jose's emotions, but also about his mounting financial pressure, had never occurred to him. This was a new angle that could change everything. Perez immediately set to work, revisiting the case with this new piece of information. He knew that the Boadia family's financial troubles had been kept secret, and now it seemed they had played a critical role in the murder of Helen. Perez had always believed that the case was about control, but now he saw it was about something more: desperation, fear, and the desperate need to escape their own situation. He gathered his team and got to work, following up on the new lead. They contacted the loan shark's associates, piecing together the financial history of the Boadia family. It became clear that the debt had been building for months, and as the walls closed in around them, Helen's disappearance had been their only way out. Perez couldn't believe it. The murder was the result of a perfect storm: jealousy, control, and a crushing financial burden that had pushed them over the edge. The Boadia family wasn't just guilty of killing Helen. They had been living in a world of lies, hidden debts, and desperation. Days later, Perez sat at his desk, reviewing the case one last time. He had spent countless hours on this investigation, but it had led him somewhere he never expected. It wasn't just about the murder of one woman. It was about the dangerous combination of emotions, finances, and desperation that had driven a family to destroy itself. The case had been solved, the criminals brought to justice, but the truth had shown him something far darker than he had anticipated. Jose, Andrea, Raul, and Tony had all played their parts, but in the end, it was their choices that had led them to this point. They could have made different decisions. They could have walked away. But their desire for control, their need to escape the pressure of their debts, had led them down a path that couldn't be undone. April 21st, 2021, the last few days had been a blur of interviews, final reports, and the slow grind of wrapping up the case. But even with everything coming to a close, Detective Perez couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The Bodia family was behind bars. The murder of Helen Arius had been solved. And yet the weight of the case still hung over him. He had seen how the crime had unfolded, how each lie built on the last, how each of them had justified their actions until it was too late. But there was something unsettling about the entire process, he says. Perez stared out the window of his office, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a long shadow over the city. The murder had been senseless, the lives of the Boadia family destroyed in a single moment of violent desperation. But it was more than just a murder case. It was about everything that led up to it. The lies, the manipulation, and the deceit. And even now, Perez couldn't understand why it had to go that far. Couldn't they have found another way? Had it all been worth it in the end? The sound of footsteps pulled Perez from his thoughts. His partner, Detective Rosa Vega, entered the office, her face solemn. "You okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. Perez didn't respond immediately, still lost in his thoughts. Finally, he let out a long breath. "I keep thinking about it. All of it. Why they did it, the lies they told themselves. And I keep wondering, could they have walked away?" Rosa sat down across from him, folding her arms. "It's hard to say, Detective. Sometimes people get trapped in their own choices, and by the time they realize what they've done, it's too late. They thought they could fix everything by keeping control. But control is exactly what led them to ruin." Perez nodded, a heavy silence hanging between them. "Yeah, I guess you're right." Rosa picked up a folder from the table, flipping through it. "But it's over now. The case is closed. Helen's family has some closure. We've done everything we can. They'll be held accountable for their actions." Perez ran a hand over his face. "I know, but something about it still doesn't sit right with me. I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about Helen. There were so many forces at play: family loyalty, guilt, desperation. It wasn't just one thing that led to her death. It was a combination of everything. And that's the part that's hard to swallow." Rosa stood up and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I get it, Detective, but sometimes that's how it is. People don't always make sense. They don't always follow the path we think they will. They make choices, bad ones, selfish ones. And those choices are the ones that lead to things like this." Perez looked at her, grateful for her words, but still feeling the weight of the case pressing down on him. "Yeah, I know. It just feels like I should have seen it coming, you know? You did the best you could," Rosa said softly. "We all did." Perez stood up and walked to the window, his eyes tracing the skyline. "I guess that's all we can do." The following days were filled with the usual administrative work, finalizing reports, meeting with the prosecutor, preparing for any final statements. But for Perez, it felt like the end of something. The case had come to a close, but the lingering feeling of helplessness and uncertainty remained. But even as the trial concluded and the justice system did its job, Perez knew that it wasn't truly over. For him, it would never be over. He had seen too much. He had lived through too many cases where the lines between right and wrong were blurred, where the motives were never as simple as they seemed. As he walked out of the office for the final time that week, Perez took one last look at the city before him. The streets were alive with people going about their business, unaware of the dark undercurrents that lay just beneath the surface. But Perez knew the truth, that in every corner, in every quiet home, there were stories waiting to be uncovered. Stories of pain, of loss, of betrayal. And for Perez, that was the real truth. No matter how many cases were closed, there would always be more waiting. More lives to investigate, more secrets to uncover, more truth to find. On April 20, 2021, the days following the case's conclusion were oddly quiet for Detective Perez. The investigation into the Bodia family's murder of Helen Arias was now behind him. The trial had come to a close, and the justice system had run its course. Yet Perez couldn't fully shake the disquiet he felt. There was always a lingering sense of incompleteness after cases like these, especially when they dealt with betrayal within families. The Boidia's tangled web of lies, the silent desperation of their lives, and the irreversible consequences of their actions made Perez question how far people would go to preserve their world. As Perez entered the station that morning, his mind was still occupied with the thought of what drove people to such extremes. The case was done, and in theory, he should have felt relief. But the emotional toll of the investigation had stayed with him, like a shadow that refused to let go. He walked to his desk and sat down, still lost in thought, when Rosa Vega entered. "Got something for you," she said, dropping a manila folder in front of him. Perez looked up, startled from his thoughts. "What's this?" "It's a follow-up on that other case we were looking into, the one with the missing girl, Sarah Matthews. We've been looking into some connections and found something interesting. Thought you'd want to see it." Perez raised an eyebrow, intrigued. The case she referred to had been on his radar for weeks, but it had taken a back seat to the Helen Arias investigation. Sarah Matthews, 17, had gone missing in a neighboring town, and though the circumstances were different from Helen's case, there were similarities, an eerie sense of familiarity in the details. Families torn apart, sudden disappearances, and a lack of clear answers. Perez flipped open the folder, scanning through the new evidence. His eyes landed on the name that made his blood run cold. Andrea Boadia. "What's this?" Perez asked, his voice sharp. Rosa paused before answering. "We've been digging into Sarah Matthews's connections, and it turns out she was last seen with someone who might be related to the Boadia family. A cousin, perhaps. We haven't confirmed the exact relationship yet, but the lead is solid enough to investigate. Sarah was seen arguing with this person in the days leading up to her disappearance." Perez frowned. "Andrea Boadia. But she's in custody for Helen's murder. What's the connection?" Rosa shrugged. "We're still piecing it together, but we think there's more to Andrea's story. We haven't spoken to her much beyond the confession about Helen. It looks like she may have had a hand in more than just that one crime. If Sarah Matthews was involved with her, then we might be dealing with something bigger than we thought." Perez's mind raced. The Boadia family was already at the center of a high-profile murder investigation. The thought that Andrea, already convicted, might be connected to a missing person case sent a chill down his spine. What was she involved in? Was it just another desperate attempt to control someone else's life? Or was there something more sinister at play? "We need to talk to her again," Perez said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in him. "Get the team ready. This case might not be as closed as we thought." That afternoon, Perez and Rosa stood outside the holding cell, where Andrea Boadia was being kept. Andrea had been cut since her confession, withdrawn and distant, but Perez knew that sometimes silence meant something more. They entered the room, the air thick with tension. Andrea sat at the table, her hands folded in front of her, eyes downcast. She didn't seem surprised to see them. "Detective Perez." "Detective Vega," Andrea said, her voice low, almost resigned. "What is it now?" Perez took a seat across from her. "We've been looking into something else, Andrea. Another case. Sarah Matthews. We think you might be connected to her disappearance." Andrea's face remained emotionless, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "I don't know anything about that," she said quickly, though her voice faltered slightly. "You know something, Andrea," Perez said, his tone calm but firm. "Sarah Matthews went missing weeks ago, and we've uncovered some new information that links you to her. We know you were seen with her. We know you had contact with her before she disappeared." Andrea shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. She bit her lip, but didn't respond immediately. "You're already facing charges for one murder, Andrea," Rosa added. "If you know anything about Sarah's case, now would be the time to speak up." Andrea's eyes flickered toward the door, then back to Paris. She sighed, a deep, resigned breath that seemed to release the weight of everything she had been holding in. "I didn't mean to get her involved," Andrea said softly. "She didn't deserve any of this." Perez leaned forward. "What happened, Andrea? Why was Sarah Matthews involved with you?" Andrea's voice broke slightly. She knew too much. She was asking too many questions about things that didn't concern her, and I didn't want her to tell anyone. I didn't want her to ruin everything." Perez frowned, his mind piecing the words together. "Ruin what? What are you talking about?" Andrea's gaze shifted downward. She had gotten close to me too, closely. She started asking questions about the things I'd been involved in. About my family. About what had happened with Helen. She didn't know the truth, but she was starting to piece things together. I didn't think she was a threat, but I couldn't take the risk. I had to make sure she didn't say anything. Perez stared at Andrea, processing the weight of her words. This wasn't just about a murder anymore. Andrea had started pulling at the threads of her own web of deceit, and Sarah Matthews had come too close to the truth. April 23rd, 2021, Detective Perez sat in the interrogation room, his mind spinning with the new revelations. Andrea's admission that Sarah Matthews had been asking questions about the Boadia family, about the murder of Helen Arias, was a game changer. Perez knew that what Andrea had said wasn't the whole truth. She was still hiding something, but the pieces were beginning to fall into place. Sarah had known too much, and for Andrea, that was a danger. But what had happened to Sarah? Had Andrea really been involved in her disappearance, or was there another layer to the story? "Detective," Rosa said as she entered the room, a sense of urgency in her voice. "We've dug into Sarah Matthews's past, and we found something. Something that links her to Andrea, and it's not what we thought." Perez looked up sharply, his attention now fully on Rosa. "What do you mean?" "We ran a background check on Sarah. She had a history of involvement with some pretty unwoodry people. She was a known associate of a local gang, and she was involved in some underground activities. What's more, she was starting to distance herself from the group just before she disappeared. We think she was trying to escape something." Perez processed the information slowly. Sarah Matthews wasn't just some innocent bystander in this case. She had been involved in something far darker than they had realized. The idea that she had been tied to a gang explained why Andrea might have felt threatened by her. But it also opened up a new possibility. What if Sarah's disappearance wasn't entirely about Helen's murder? What if it was connected to something more dangerous? "Do we know who she was associating with?" Perez asked, his voice steady. Rosa nodded. "We've traced some of her last known contacts, and we're still working on it. But one name stood out, Tony D'Amico. He's a low-level enforcer for a local syndicate. We've been tracking his movements, and we found that he met with Sarah a few days before she vanished." Perez's heart skipped a beat. Tony. The same Tony who had been involved in helping cover up Helen's murder. "Tony D'Amico," Perez repeated. "What was his connection to Sarah?" "We don't know yet, but we're trying to pull on that thread. It seems like she had a falling out with him, and that might have been the tipping point. Tony may have been the one who silenced her." Perez sat back in his chair, processing everything. This was far more complicated than he had imagined. Helen's murder had been only the beginning. Now they were dealing with gang ties, cover-ups, and a girl caught in the middle of a dangerous world. What had started as a case of love and control had escalated into something far more intricate. "Get the team on this," Perez said, his voice firm. "We need to find Tony. If he's involved in Sarah's disappearance, He's not just a witness anymore. He's a suspect. That afternoon, Perez and Rosa met with the rest of the team to discuss the next steps. They needed to track down Tony D'Amico before he vanished again. But as they discussed their plan, a call came in. One of their officers had found something in the woods near the area where Helen's body had been discovered. Perez's pulse quickened. The case was starting to unravel again, and he could feel it slipping away from him. "What did they find?" he asked, his voice tight. "We're not sure yet, Detective," the officer replied. "But it's a possible match. It's a body." Perez's mind raced as he and Rosa raced to the location. The team was already there, standing near the edge of the woods. A forensics team was gathered around, taking pictures and marking off the area. As Perez approached, he could see the outline of a body covered by a sheet. He stepped closer, his stomach sinking. "Is it her?" Perez asked. The lead forensic investigator nodded grimly. "We're still confirming, but it looks like it's Sarah Matthews." Perez's heart dropped. The truth about Sarah Matthews's disappearance was beginning to take shape, and it wasn't going to be easy to stomach. Hours later, Perez stood over Sarah's body in the morgue, reviewing the autopsy report. It was clear now that Sarah's death wasn't an accident. She had been strangled, much like Helen. But the cause of death wasn't the only thing that stood out. Sarah had defensive wounds, just like Helen. She had fought back. But unlike Helen, she had been left to die alone in the woods, discarded like nothing more than a piece of trash. Perez's mind raced through the possibilities. Tony D'Amico's name kept coming up, and now with Sarah's body being discovered near the same area Helen had been buried, the connection seemed undeniable. But where did this lead? What was Tony's role in all of this? The next day, Perez and Rosa went to Tony D'Amico's last known address. They had information that Tony was hiding out in a small apartment in the outskirts of town. The building was old, the windows grimy, and the air thick with the stench of neglect. Perez and Rosa moved quickly, knowing that they had to find Tony before he slipped away again. They knocked on the door, their guns drawn, ready for anything. When the door creaked open, a man with a scruffy face and a weary expression appeared. "Tony D'Amico," Perez said, his voice firm. "You're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Matthews and for aiding in the cover-up of Helen Arias's death." Tony didn't resist. His eyes, bloodshot and tired, seemed to have given up. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he muttered, his voice weak. "I was just doing what I was told. I didn't want to be involved in any of this." Perez stepped forward. "You've been involved from the beginning. It's time to tell me the truth, Tony. Where is it all going?" Tony shook his head, tears welling in his eyes. "I didn't want to be part of this mess. But it's too late now. I know what you want. You want the whole story, don't you?" Perez nodded. "All right," Tony said, his voice hollow. "It all started with Helen. But after she was gone, things just spiraled. Sarah, she had to go. She was too close to everything. I couldn't let her live. She knew too much." April 24th, 2021, as the days stretched on, the pieces of the puzzle continued to fall into place. But the picture that emerged was darker than Detective Perez had imagined. Tony D'Amico's confession had brought some clarity to the case, but the depth of his involvement left Perez with a sinking feeling in his chest. The web of lies, manipulation, and murder extended far beyond what Perez had initially thought. What had started as the tragic murder of one woman had now turned into a complex, multi-layered case involving several people, some of whom were far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Perez sat at his desk, reviewing the latest details. Tony's confession had confirmed his role in the murder of Sarah Matthews, but it also opened up new questions. Tony had admitted to helping cover up Helen Arias's murder, but he still hadn't fully explained why. He had been a part of the cover-up, but his motives were still unclear. And now, the connections between the Boadia family, Tony, and the gang ties were becoming more pronounced. Perez knew this wasn't just about two families at war anymore. It was about a network of criminals, power struggles, and people willing to kill to protect their secrets. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The complexity of it all was overwhelming. Sarah Matthews's death, the connection to Tony D'Amico, the gang connections, it all pointed to a darker underbelly of the city that Perez wasn't sure he was ready to face. The phone on his desk rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Rosa. "Detective," she said, her voice urgent. "We've got another lead on Tony. He's been talking to someone." A name just came up in the conversation with his associate, and it's linked to an old contact of his. Someone we haven't looked into yet. Perez's interest piqued. "Who is it?" "Ricardo Vargas," Rosa replied. "He's a name from the past. He's got ties to organized crime, and we think he might be the one pulling Tony's strings. Vargas has a history of dealing with high-level criminals, and he's known for being very elusive. We've been tracking his movements, but he's been off the radar for a while." Perez's pulse quickened. If Ricardo Vargas was involved, this case had just taken a whole new turn. The investigation into the Boadia family's actions had always felt personal jealousy, control, betrayal, but now it was becoming something bigger. Organized crime was a whole different level, and Perez wasn't sure they were prepared for what they might uncover. "Get the team together," Perez said, his voice steady. "We're going after Vargas. We need to know who he's working with and what his involvement is in all of this. If he's connected to Tony, then he's connected to the murder." By the time Perez and Rosa arrived at the meeting point, their team had already gathered. They were ready. Their target, Ricardo Vargas, was someone Perez had heard of, but never directly dealt with, until now. The thought of going after someone with so many criminal connections sent a chill down Perez's spine. But he was determined. This case had already cost too much, and he wasn't about to back down now. They moved quickly, setting up surveillance at Vargas's known locations. They scoured his connections, pulling together every lead they could find. Perez knew the clock was ticking. Vargas was a man who didn't stay in one place for too long, and the more time they wasted, the more likely it was that he would slip through their fingers. By the evening, Perez got the call they'd been waiting for. Vargas had been spotted at a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It was an old, run-down building, the kind of place where illicit deals were made, and Perez had a bad feeling about what they might find inside. The team moved in quickly, quietly, their movements synchronized. As Perez and Rosa approached the warehouse, the sound of distant footsteps echoed in the dark. They ducked behind a stack of crates, watching carefully as Vargas and several of his associates entered the building. Perez's instincts told him to wait, to make sure they had enough evidence before making a move. But the pressure was mounting. They needed to act fast before Vargas disappeared again. Inside the warehouse, Vargas was talking to Tony. Perez could hear snippets of their conversation, but the words were muffled by the thick walls of the building. Whatever was happening between them, it didn't sound good. Perez motioned for his team to move in, signaling that it was time to confront them. They broke through the warehouse door, guns drawn, and Perez shouted, "Freeze, police!" Vargas looked up in surprise, his eyes wide with shock. But there was no fear in his expression. He was calm, almost too calm. He turned to his associates, who were already pulling out weapons. Perez's team responded quickly, taking cover behind the crates and returning fire. The standoff was brief, but intense. Perez's heart raced as the gunfire echoed through the warehouse. He could hear the tension building, the threat of violence in the air. Then, as quickly as it had started, it ended. Vargas was arrested, his associates taken into custody, and the warehouse cleared. Back at the station, Perez sat across from Vargas in the interrogation room. The man was calm, collected, almost too collected. He didn't seem fazed by the arrest, as if he had expected it all along. "You've got nothing on me," Vargas said with a smirk. "You think you can tie me to Helen Arias's death? You've got no proof." Perez leaned forward, his eyes cold. "You've been involved in organized crime for years, Vargas. You know how to cover your tracks." But Tony D'Amico confessed. "We know you're connected. We know you're the one who's been pulling the strings. So what's it going to be?" Vargas chuckled. "You think Tony talks? He doesn't have a clue what he's involved in. This isn't just about Helen. It's bigger than that. But if you think I'm going to tell you anything, detective, you're wasting your time." Perez stood up, his patience running thin. "You're going to tell me everything, Vargas. It's only a matter of time." Vargas's smirk faded as he looked at Perez. "We'll see how long you last before the walls close in on you too." April 25, 2021, the arrest of Ricardo Vargas had rattled the case wide open. But as Detective Perez sat at his desk, reviewing the latest developments, he realized that things were only getting more complicated. Vargas, despite his bravado in the interrogation room, had given nothing away. His silence was maddening, but Perez wasn't surprised. People like Vargas didn't crack easily. But the fact that he was so calm, almost too calm, meant one thing. He knew something Perez didn't. It was only a matter of time before the pressure built up enough for Vargas to reveal his cards. Perez had spent enough time in this line of work to know that every lead would eventually come back to one place, the heart of the crime. And right now, that heart was Ricardo Vargas and his involvement with Tony D'Amico, the Boadia family, and a web of criminal connections that went deeper than anyone had suspected. "Detective," Rosa's voice broke through Perez's thoughts as she walked into his office. "We've got a breakthrough." Perez looked up, his interest piqued. "What have you got?" "We've been going through Vargas's contacts," Rosa continued, "and we found something interesting. There's a series of wire transfers, all traced back to an offshore account. It's not linked directly to him, but it is linked to someone who's been in the background of this case, someone who might have more involvement than we realized." Perez leaned forward, his focus sharpening. "Who?" "Jose Boadia," Rosa said quietly. Perez's mind reeled. "Jose? How?" Rosa slid a printout across the desk. "It's a series of transactions between Vargas and Boadia. But here's the kicker, these payments were made right after Helen's death. They are linked to a third party that we haven't identified yet, but they are consistent. It looks like Jose may have been paying Vargas to keep quiet about the murder." Perez's heart sank. He had suspected the Boadia family was hiding more than just their involvement in Helen's death. But this was something else. Jose, desperate to protect himself, had paid Vargas to cover up the crime, ensuring that no one else would get caught in the fallout. It was a calculated move, but it was also the kind of desperation that led to even bigger mistakes. "We need to get to the bottom of this," Perez said, his voice steady. "Track down who else is involved. If Jose was paying Vargas, then we're dealing with more than just a family cover-up. We're dealing with organized crime." That evening, Perez and Rosa met with the rest of the team. They laid out the new lead, and the team immediately set to work, pulling together the resources they needed to track down the mysterious third party linked to the payments. The stakes were higher now. The Boadia family wasn't just a family caught in a tragic spiral of jealousy and fear. They were now part of something much larger, something more dangerous. Perez spent the night reviewing old case files, trying to piece together the missing link. He knew that the third party was still out there, hiding in the shadows. But who were they? And how deep did their involvement go? The next day, Perez and Rosa arrived at the station to find a new lead. One of the officers had managed to trace the wire transfer back to a shell company, a legitimate front for a criminal operation. It didn't take long for Perez to connect the dots. The company was linked to a known crime syndicate that had been operating in the area for years. They had ties to organized crime, drug trafficking, and money laundering. And now they were connected to the Boadia family. Perez knew the next step was clear. They needed to take down the entire network, but that would require something more than just interrogation and arrests. They needed leverage. They needed to take down the head of the syndicate. And to do that, they needed to get to the heart of the organization. Later that evening, Perez stood in front of the warehouse, his hand gripping the handle of his gun. The building was dark, a heavy silence hanging in the air. The intel had led them here, to the warehouse on the outskirts of town, where the syndicate's operations were based. This was where the strings were being pulled. This was where everything connected. Perez motioned for his team to move in. They entered the warehouse, their footsteps muffled by the concrete floors. The place was empty at first glance, but Perez knew better. The syndicate wasn't just going to leave their operation unprotected. He could feel it in his gut. There was something in the air, a sense of impending danger. "Clear the rooms," Perez ordered. The team fanned out, and Perez and Rosa made their way down the narrow hallway. The low hum of fluorescent lights echoed in the quiet. As they approached the end of the hall, Perez's heart rate picked up. He knew they were close. They reached a door at the end of the hallway. Perez motioned for Rosa to take the lead. She nodded, her fingers brushing the handle. But before she could turn it, the door opened. Two men stood in front of them, their expressions unreadable, weapons drawn. Perez's instincts kicked in. "Police, drop your weapons." A standoff ensued, each side waiting for the other to make the first issue. But the silence didn't last long. A voice from inside the room spoke up, cutting through the tension. "Detective Perez," the voice said, smooth and controlled. "I've been expecting you." Perez's eyes widened as he recognized the voice. The man standing before him wasn't just another thug. It was the head of the syndicate, the one who had been pulling the strings all along, Carlos Medina. Perez said, his voice steady. "I should have known it was you." Medina smiled, his gaze never leaving Perez. "You've been digging around in places you shouldn't, detective. But it's too late now. The game's over." Perez's grip tightened on his gun. "Not yet, Carlos. Not while I'm still standing." April 26, 2021, the standoff in the warehouse with Carlos Medina had been brief. But it left Perez with a burning question: how far would Medina go to protect his empire? Medina had been calm when he spoke, almost too calm, as if he knew Perez and his team would eventually find their way to him. The air was thick with tension, and Perez could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He couldn't afford to make a misstep. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls. The two men who had confronted Perez and Rosa stood still, their guns trained on them. But it was clear they were waiting for a signal from Medina. He was the one in control, the one who held all the cards. Perez couldn't let that stand. Not now, not after everything he'd been through. He had one shot to bring down Medina and finally uncover the full extent of the syndicate's operations. "Carlos," Perez said, his voice steady, "it's over. We know everything about you. About the Boadias. About Ellen. About Sarah Matthews." Medina's lips curled into a slow smile, almost amused. "You think you know everything, detective? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Perez stepped closer, his eyes locked on Medina's. I know you're the one who's been pulling the strings. You're the one who's been hiding behind your little puppets, Vargas, Tony, the Boadius. All of them are just your pawns. But I'm done playing games. It's over, Carlos. You're going down. Medina's smile faltered for a moment, but then he recovered, his eyes darkening. You don't understand, detective. You never did. This isn't just about some petty murder. This is about power, control. You think you can just waltz in and take it all away from me? Yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to do, Perez replied. You've been running a criminal empire, and it ends today. You're done. Medina's eyes flashed with rage, and before Perez could react, the two men raised their guns ready to fire. But just as quickly, Perez's team moved in. A flurry of gunshots rang out, but none of them were aimed at Perez. In a matter of seconds, the two men were on the ground, disarmed and restrained. Medina's face twisted with fury as he took a step back. You think you've won, detective? You have no idea what you've just walked into. Perez didn't flinch. He was done listening to threats. You're under arrest for the murders of Helen Arias and Sarah Matthews, along with your involvement in organizing a criminal syndicate. You have the right to remain silent. Carlos Medina, the kingpin of the operation, had been caught. But there was still one question left in Perez's mind. How deep did the syndicate run? How many others were involved? And how much more would they uncover once they took down Medina? Back at the station, the weight of the arrest settled over Perez. Carlos Medina was finally in custody, and the case that had started as a search for the truth behind Helen's murder had turned into something much bigger. The criminal empire Medina ran had stretched its roots far deeper than Perez had anticipated. And now, with him behind bars, it was time to uncover everything. Perez stood in front of the interrogation room, looking through the one-way mirror at Carlos, who was sitting at the table, his arms folded, his face impassive. Rosa entered the room, taking a seat beside him. We've got him, detective, she said, her voice quiet but filled with relief. Medina is finally off the streets. Perez nodded, but there was no sense of satisfaction in his eyes. It's not over yet, Rosa. We still have to figure out just how deep his connections go. He's the head of the snake, but there are others out there, other people involved. We'll get there, Rosa replied. It's just a matter of time. And now that we have Medina in custody, we can start pulling apart his network. Perez turned his gaze back to the room where Carlos sat. The kingpin was quiet, but Perez knew he was holding something back. He wouldn't break easily. But Perez had one advantage: time. We start with him, Perez said, his voice resolute. We pressure him, and we make him talk. I don't care how long it takes. He's not leaving here until we know everything. The following days were filled with relentless interrogation. Medina was as calm and composed as ever, but it was clear that the pressure was starting to get to him. He wouldn't give up information easily, but with each passing hour, Perez could see cracks beginning to form in his resolve. The cold, calculating man who had ruled his criminal empire with an iron fist was starting to feel the weight of the walls closing in. Perez leaned forward during one of the sessions, his voice steady but commanding. Carlos, you can keep playing this game, or you can tell me what I need to know. The longer you stay silent, the worse it's going to get for you. Medina's lips twisted into a sneer. You think you've won? You think you can just take everything I've built and walk away with it? Perez's eyes didn't waver. You're going to tell me who else is involved. You're going to tell me everything you've done. And when we're done with you, you'll be the one looking over your shoulder, wondering who's coming for you next. Medina's eyes flickered for a moment, a flash of something fear, maybe crossing his face. Perez knew they were getting closer. It was just a matter of time before he cracked. April 27th, 2021, the interrogation of Carlos Medina had gone on for days, and yet the kingpin of the syndicate remained stubbornly silent. Despite the mounting pressure, the threats, and the promises of an even worse fate if he didn't cooperate, Medina's demeanor hadn't changed. He was calm, too calm, like a man who had seen it all and wasn't afraid to face the consequences. Perez sat across from him, frustration simmering beneath the surface. It had been days, and Medina still wouldn't budge. The case had grown more complicated than Perez could have ever imagined, and each layer they peeled back only revealed more dangerous connections. "Carlos," Perez said, his voice low but intense, "I know you're not stupid. You know exactly what's coming. You're facing life in prison, or worse. The people you've hurt, the lives you've destroyed, they were not just going to go away. The longer you stay quiet, the harder it's going to get for you." Medina didn't even blink. He simply stared back at Perez, his hands resting calmly on the table in front of him. "I've been through worse than this," he said quietly. "You can keep threatening me, detective, but it won't change anything." Perez's patience was running thin, but he couldn't let himself lose control. "I don't want to play games with you, Carlos. I'm not here for some power struggle. I'm here to get answers. You're going to tell me everything: who's behind this operation, who else is involved, where this network leads. Because if you don't, you'll be left to rot in here. And I promise you, no one will care what happens to you after that." Medina's eyes flickered slightly, just a brief moment of uncertainty that Perez latched onto. He leaned forward, his voice lowering to a deadly calm. "You're going to help me take down this entire syndicate, Carlos," Perez said, his words cutting through the silence. "You're going to start talking." For the first time, Perez saw a crack in Medina's armor. The kingpin shifted in his seat, his gaze flickering to the door. It was as though he were contemplating whether to say something, whether to risk it all for a chance at a lighter sentence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Medina sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You really think you can stop it?" he asked, his voice a mixture of amusement and resignation. "I've been running this for years. You think you're going to undo all of it with your little questions?" Perez didn't respond immediately, allowing the silence to stretch. He knew that once Medina began to speak, it would all start unraveling. Carlos took a deep breath and continued, "You have no idea how big this operation is. It's not just about drugs, money, and power. It's about influence. And once you start pulling at these threads, you'll find that it goes all the way to the top." Perez's pulse quickened. This was it. Medina had just dropped the biggest hint yet. "What do you mean? What top are you talking about?" Medina's lips curled into a smile, one that was far from reassuring. "You think it's just about me? About my syndicate? Think again. I've had connections for years high up in politics, in law enforcement. You're playing in the kiddie pool, detective. The real players, they don't care about you." Perez stared at him, his heart hammering in his chest. "Who are they, Carlos? Who's at the top?" Medina leaned forward slightly, his gaze narrowing. "You won't like what you find, detective. But if you really want to know, it's not just your local criminals. It's a whole different world. The people who run this city, they're the ones who pull the strings, and you're just a pawn in their game." Perez's mind raced as he absorbed the implications of Medina's words. This wasn't just about a few criminals anymore. This was bigger, much bigger than he had anticipated. There were people in positions of power, people who had been protecting Medina and his operation for years. Perez knew they had to dig deeper, but he wasn't sure how far he was willing to go. Later that night, Perez met with Rosa and the rest of the team to debrief. The information Medina had given them was a bombshell, and they had to tread carefully. The idea that the syndicate had powerful backers in high places was more than just a let it, was a game changer. We have to be careful, Perez warned. Medina's telling us something, but I don't trust him. If he's right, we're looking at a much bigger operation than we thought. We need to follow the money, follow the connections, but we can't make any moves until we're sure. Rosa nodded, her face grim. What do we do about Medina? Do we continue the interrogation, or do we give him a deal? Perez thought for a moment. He had always believed in getting the truth from criminals, but now it was clear that this wasn't just about the Boadia family, or even Medina. This was about a much larger conspiracy. If Medina really had the connections he claimed, it would take more than just a confession to take him down. We push him harder, Perez said finally. We don't give him a deal yet. If we let him think we're desperate for answers, we'll lose our leverage. Keep him talking, but don't make any promises. We need more from him, and we need to be sure we're getting the full story. The following days were filled with more interrogation, but Medina's responses became more cryptic. He had told them just enough to make them think he was opening up, but Perez knew better. Every time they thought they were getting closer, Medina pulled away, leaving them with more questions. It wasn't until Perez received an anonymous tip that the case finally took another turn. A trusted informant had reached out, telling Perez that they had information on the high-level connections Medina had been hinting at. It was a dangerous lead, one that could put Perez and his team at risk, but they had no choice. They had to follow it. April 28, 2021, the anonymous tip had shaken Perez. He'd been through enough cases to know that informants, especially anonymous ones, didn't always have the full picture. But there was something in the message that rang true. The idea that Carlos Medina wasn't working alone, that his syndicate had powerful allies in high places. Perez knew he had to follow up on it, but with caution. This wasn't just a case of small-time criminals anymore. It was about bringing down a network that had its roots in places Perez had never dreamed of. Perez sat in his office, staring at the piece of paper that had arrived with the tip. It was brief, vague even, but it hinted at a man named Gregory Blackwood, a name Perez had heard in whispers, but never connected to anything substantial. Blackwood was a name associated with high-end investments, business dealings, and most importantly, connections to the police and political figures in the city. The tip didn't provide much more than that, but it was enough to get Perez's attention. "Detective," Rosa's voice came through the intercom. "You need to see this." Perez leaned forward. "What is it?" "We've tracked down Blackwood," she replied. "He's in town. We've got an address. And there's something else. It looks like he's been moving a lot of money through offshore accounts. We may have him tied directly to Medina's operations." Perez stood up, adrenaline surging. This was it, the connection they had been missing. If Blackwood was really involved, it could change everything. Perez grabbed his coat. "Let's move. We need to get eyes on him. If he's involved with Medina, we need to know everything about him." By the time Perez and Rosa arrived at Blackwood's luxury penthouse, they were already on high alert. Blackwood was a powerful man, and Perez knew that a confrontation with him could bring trouble. But trouble had been following Perez for years, and he wasn't about to back down now. They parked across the street and watched as Blackwood's sleek black car pulled into the garage beneath the building. The penthouse was located in one of the most exclusive parts of the city, and Blackwood's lifestyle screamed money that came from connections Perez was only beginning to understand. "We need to get inside, find his files, and see what we can connect him to," Perez said, his voice sharp. "Keep it quiet. No one gets in and no one gets out until we have what we need." Rosa nodded, and the two detectives slipped inside the building. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt like it took an eternity. The hum of the elevator cables making the tension palpable. When they reached the top floor, Perez gestured for Rosa to take the left hallway while he moved to the right. Blackwood's penthouse had a sprawling layout, and Perez wasn't taking any chances. They moved carefully, checking each room until they reached the office at the back of the penthouse. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Perez could see stacks of paperwork on the desk. His gut told him this was where Blackwood kept everything: the records, the deals, the proof that would tie him to Medina. Perez nudged the door open, and they both slipped inside. The office was immaculately organized, but the presence of high-end technology computers, a safe in the corner, told Perez that Blackwood had been careful, methodical in his dealings. Perez approached the desk and quickly began searching the drawers, his mind racing through what they might find. Rosa was the first to find something of interest. "Detective, you need to see this," she said, holding up a folder marked with Blackwood's name and a series of coded numbers. Perez's pulse quickened. "What's inside?" Rosa opened the folder, revealing a series of transaction records. They were complex, but Perez could make out the familiar names, the ones connected to Medina, to the syndicate. There were offshore accounts listed, payments made for illegal arms shipments, and most troubling of all, transfers directly to police accounts, to city officials. Blackwood wasn't just a businessman. He was the middleman between Medina and the city's power players. "This is it," Perez said, his voice tense. "This is how the syndicate kept everything running through Blackwood's connections. We've got the link to the top." Rosa looked up, her face grim. "We need to take this back. But we can't move on Blackwood yet. If we confront him now, he'll just disappear." Perez thought for a moment. "We need to go straight to the DA with this. We've got the evidence we need to take down the whole operation. But we'll need to be careful. Blackwood is too connected to let this go down easily." The next few hours were a blur of phone calls, strategy meetings, and preparation for what would come next. The evidence against Blackwood was substantial, but Perez knew that bringing him down would require more than just paperwork. They needed to connect the dots between the Boadius, Medina, and the city's corrupt officials. If Blackwood was the key to unraveling the entire network, then they had to take him down without alerting him to their moves. Perez couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. As they prepared for the next phase of the investigation, he knew that exposing the syndicate's ties to the city's powerful figures would be dangerous. But it was a risk he was willing to take. They couldn't let people like Medina and Blackwood continue to operate in the shadows. Not anymore. April 29th, 2021, the weight of the evidence against Carlos Medina, Ricardo Blackwood, and the entire syndicate had finally reached a breaking point. The files and the records recovered from Blackwood's penthouse were a gold mine. But it wasn't enough to just have the documents. The question now was how to use them without tipping off the very people who were trying to control the city. Perez stood at his desk staring at the stacks of files and digital records, his mind already working through the next steps. He had no illusions. This was going to be a battle. The city's most powerful figures wouldn't go down without a fight. Rosa entered, her face serious. "Detective, we've got a problem. Blackwood's lawyer is already circling the case. He's demanding to see the evidence, claiming a violation of rights." Perez didn't flinch. "Of course he is. We knew this would happen. But we've got something they won't expect. We've been tracking Blackwood's connections to the city's officials, and we've got some of them in our sights now. If they think we're going to back down, they're sorely mistaken." Rosa nodded. "So, we go public?" Perez leaned back in his chair, his mind made up. "Not yet. We can't expose everything at once. We need to hit them with a coordinated strike. Get the DA to make a move first. We'll need to hit Blackwood, Medina and his associates, with everything we have at VOL. If they see us coming, they'll scatter, and we can't afford that. The team spent the next few days preparing, making sure every lead was covered, every detail accounted for. Perez met with the DA's office, briefing them on the growing case against Blackwood and his criminal network. He couldn't afford any mistakes, and he knew that every move they made would have consequences. The city's most powerful people had been untouchable for far too long, but Perez had the evidence, and now it was time to expose the truth. By the night of April 30th, 2021, Perez and his team were ready. They had everything in place: the warrants, the undercover officers, the evidence linking Blackwood to the highest levels of government corruption. And now, they had the green light to move. Perez stood outside the city courthouse, looking up at the building that housed the very system he was trying to break. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his career working within that system, but tonight, he was going to expose its flaws for everyone to see. Tonight, we take them all down, Perez said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. Rosa stood beside him, her expression matching his. This isn't just about Blackwood. This is about the whole system. We're doing it for Helen, for Sarah, and for everyone who's been hurt by this network. The team assembled, and Perez briefed them one last time. We move in fast. We hit Blackwood's properties. We hit the city officials who've been involved. And we don't stop until we've got everything. This is it, our one shot. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Perez and his team split up, hitting multiple targets at once. Blackwood's luxury penthouse was raided by the SWAT team, while other officers moved in on the homes and offices of the corrupt officials who had been in bed with the syndicate. The DA's office, working in tandem with the police, made the arrests as quickly as possible, seizing documents, assets, and making it clear that the days of unchecked power were over. Perez led the operation at Blackwood's penthouse. The doors were kicked in, and the team moved inside, guns drawn. Blackwood was sitting at his desk, the same cold smirk on his face that Perez had seen before. "I knew you'd come for me eventually," Blackwood said, his voice still full of arrogance. "But it's too late, Detective. You think you can take down all of this with a few documents? You've already lost." Perez stepped forward, locking eyes with him. "It's not just a few documents, Carlos. It's everything you've built. It's the people you've bought, the lives you've destroyed. And now it's over. You're done." Blackwood's face twitched slightly, and Perez could see the fear creeping in. He knew it was over for him. There was nowhere left to run. Hours later, Perez sat at his desk again, exhausted but satisfied. The operation had been a success. Blackwood, Medina, and several high-ranking city officials had been arrested. The syndicate that had controlled the city for years had been brought down piece by piece. Perez knew it wasn't the end of the story, but it was a victory, a long overdue one. Rosa entered the office, her face lit with the kind of satisfaction that came from a job well done. "We got them all, Detective. Every single one. This is going to make waves, and it's going to change things around here." Perez nodded, his mind still racing through the events of the night. "We did it. But we can't stop here. This isn't the end of corruption in this city. It's just the beginning. We've got to keep pushing." Rosa smiled. "And we will." Perez stood up, looking out the window at the city skyline. It had been a long, hard road, but they had done it. They had taken down the empire, exposed the corruption, and brought justice to the people who had suffered. As the night wore on, Perez felt the weight of the case lift. There would always be more work to do, more cases to solve. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The city had been changed, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like there was hope. April 30th, 2021, the aftermath of the arrests was as chaotic as it was satisfying. The morning after the takedown, Perez stood in his office, the weight of the victory settling in. But his mind was still spinning. The operation had been successful. Blackwood, Medina, and a network of powerful officials had been arrested, but Perez knew this wasn't the end. This victory was a small one in a city plagued by corruption, and while this case had concluded, it had exposed a much larger problem. The reality of systemic corruption, of dangerous networks operating in the shadows, was something Perez couldn't ignore. The fight was far from over. Rosa entered the room with a look of exhaustion on her face. "Detective," she said, her voice weary but firm. "It's done. The press is going wild, and the DA is already preparing for the trial. We've got a lot of work ahead of us, but we've made an impact." Perez nodded, but remained silent for a moment, his eyes still focused on the pile of case files on his desk. "Yeah, we've made an impact, but it's not enough. There's more, Rosa. This didn't just end with these arrests. We've pulled the string, and now we have to follow where it leads. The people who were pulling the strings, they're still out there." Rosa sat down across from him, sensing his unease. "I get it. You're thinking about the bigger picture, the ones who've been pulling the strings for so long, the power brokers who are still in control." Perez leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Exactly. These arrests are just the tip of the iceberg. We've exposed a lot, but there is still a lot of work left to do. And we can't do it alone. We need to stay focused." Rosa sighed, her gaze falling on the files. "So what now?" Perez stood up, walking over to the window and looking out at the city. The skyline seemed peaceful in the early morning light, but Perez knew that peace was fragile. "Now we wait. We keep pushing. We keep investigating. And we make sure this doesn't happen again. We've exposed one syndicate, but who else is out there? Who's still untouchable?" The days that followed were filled with meetings, press conferences, and a flurry of legal proceedings. The arrest of Carlos Medina and his syndicate had made headlines across the city, and the case had been a significant victory. The streets were buzzing with talk of the arrests, of the police bringing down powerful figures who had been hiding in plain sight. It was a rare win for the good guys, and Perez felt the weight of the public's expectations on his shoulders. But as the days passed, something began to eat at him. The case had been too clean, too easy. Medina had talked, Blackwood had cracked, and the others had followed suit. It was almost too perfect. Perez had been trained to trust his instincts, and they were telling him that something didn't quite add up. There was a final piece missing. That evening, Perez sat in his office once again, staring at the case files. He had gone over the evidence so many times that it had all started to blur together, but one thing kept nagging at him, the missing link. As he looked over the last set of transactions from Blackwood's files, something caught his eye. A name that hadn't come up in any of the previous interrogations. A name that was hidden behind layers of financial transactions and legal documents. Perez's pulse quickened. The name was linked to several of the city's most influential figures, people who had managed to stay out of the spotlight for years. He stared at the name for a moment, his heart sinking as the realization hit him. David Halloran, Perez muttered under his breath. The city councilman. Perez's mind raced. Halloran was known for his clean image, his public commitment to anti-corruption, and his popularity in the city. He had built a reputation as a man who cared about the people, a man who fought for justice. But the more Perez thought about it, the more he realized that this might have been the perfect disguise. Halloran was connected to Blackwood's syndicate, there was no doubt about it. But what was his role in all of this? Had he been working with Medina and Blackwood from the start? Perez didn't waste any time. He called Rosa immediately, his voice urgent. Rosa, we need to move on. David Halloran, he's been linked to Blackwood. We need to bring him in. Rosa's response was swift. I'll get the team on it. We'll track his movements, see where he's been. We can't let him slip through our fingers. Hours later, Perez stood outside a grand building, a government office, one of Halloran's most trusted locations. The weight of the investigation had just become much heavier. Halloran was a powerful figure, and confronting him would be dangerous. But it was the only lead left. Perez knew that if they didn't move now, Halloran would disappear into the shadows, just like the others before him. With his team in position, Perez and Rosa approached the building, their hearts pounding in unison. They had everything they needed, the evidence, the connections, and now, the truth about the city's most powerful officials. The final chapter of the case was about to begin. And Perez wasn't going to let Halloran get away with it.